Before we get into the show, I wanted to put out a hiring call. I'm looking for my next software engineering apprentice, a young .NET programmer to help me directly with my work, building architectural prototypes, figuring out new patterns, tons of coding. And I'm looking for a .NET programmer whose hobby is also programming. For the right person, programming isn't work, it's play. And besides a job, I can guarantee that you will learn faster than you ever have before. And I will invest in your professional education and we'll work together and you will grow. You'll report directly to me. So if any of this sounds interesting to you, just send me an email or give me a call. Now, let's get into our show. Philosophy on Architecture with Rockford Lhotka.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm serving companies with very important business critical software projects, and ClearMeasure can deliver those. You can find them at clearmeasure.com. A quick announcement, we're in our second year of my architect forums. You can sign up for the next session. You can find a link in the show notes. And basically, if you lead a software team and you're looking to collaborate with other peer architect leaders, then just sign up at the link. We understand there's tons of educational avenues for developers and how to write code and build certain applications, but not so much for people who are actually in a role where they need to lead groups of developers. And so this is a peer forum where we can sharpen each other. And if you're looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, you can just search for it in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. Now, my guest today on the show is Rockford Lhotka. He's the VP of Strategy at Xebia and the Chief Software Architect at Marimer LLC. He's the creator of the open source CSLA .NET development framework, the author of numerous books, and a regular speaker at major conferences around the world. Rockford is a member of the Microsoft Regional Director and MVP programs, and he is a returning guest on the podcast. We'll include a link to his last episode where we dove deep into CSLA. That was at episode 210, so we'll include a link in the show notes. So, Rocky, welcome back to the show. How are you, sir?
Oh, I'm great. Glad to be here.
Oh, I'm glad you are too. It's been over a year since we've had you on the show, but glad you're back. I think some of the things with you since then have changed. What are the big updates to kind of lead you into what you're focusing on today, your day-to-day work?
Well, a year ago was about the time I joined a company called Xebia, which is now called Xebia. But I call myself semi-retired at this point. So I do some work at Xebia from a strategic perspective. And then I also have my own company that supports CSLA and does CSLA consulting and training. And so, yeah, I spend a fair amount of time, working on CSLA and a fair amount of time helping Xebia, especially the Microsoft service area within Xebia, be successful. So it's pretty much a lot of fun.
Nice. And just to touch on CSLA, it's kind of remarkable, in my opinion, that you've kept a framework that kind of embeds certain patterns, but kept it compatible with all of the latest versions of .NET and C# when this is over 20-something year, 25 years old, right?
Yeah, really? I think it's right now. I think it's close to 27 or in that ballpark. Yeah,
right. Because there's been tons of frameworks out there that are kind of locked into a particular version of a technology, and this one, I mean, you made the transition to .NET Core, and now, I mean, you can use it on any type of .NET application, mobile apps, Blazor WebAssembly, just everything. So it didn't get locked in in a corner like some frameworks do, and then they get old and stale. You kept it fresh.
I and continue to try and do so. Yeah, it's part of it. I guess I like building tools and framework, that transcend any particular application, but also early in my career, in fact, most of my career has been focused on building, I don't know what you call them, enterprise apps or line of business apps, but basically the sort of thing that helps a company run or a big part of a company run. And the thing about those apps is that they last 10, 15, 20 years, right?
Yeah.
And often a lot longer than maybe we would prefer. And I very early in my career had some good mentors and good role models, and some bad ones, of course, too. But and maybe that's just as important, the bad ones, right? Because you see what people are not doing well, right? And I've always tried to learn those lessons and then bring them forward. And so that all of that informs CSLA and how I think about it. And the way you framed it is awesome, but it's actually a little messier than that, because the reality is there have been some breaking changes that are quite substantial that affected the CSLA user base. And usually those have been driven by tech changes, like when Silverlight showed up. It was a major rewrite because prior to that, CSLA assumed Windows. And Silverlight was I had a team of, I think, 5 people, and we worked for about 3-4 months and really did major changes because we couldn't rely on Windows. We couldn't rely on reflection. There was a bunch of stuff that, and that one thing, I look back through the history of CSLA, and there's probably 2 major inflection points. One is it originally, I maintained it in both VB and C#. This was at the beginning of .NET, right? And that was possible because of a guy named Brant Estes, who helped get the C# version working originally, and then ultimately we dropped VB. So that was a huge inflection point. And then the other one, that we were just talking about, was this divorcing from Windows. Becoming, I guess you'd say, purely .NET, because .NET arguably is not tied to Windows either, right?
Yeah, it's cross-platform, totally.
And especially now. But what's interesting is, because we did all that work in 2000, I want to say 2007, things like supporting Windows Phone, supporting .NET Core, were relatively easy because we'd already done all that work to make it make CSLA cross-platform and work on at least 2 different versions or flavors of .NET. So
yeah, I can see that, because Silverlight worked as installed Mac applications too. So definitely any Windows APIs were not going to work. So
so it was and really, I guess we weren't too tied to Windows, but we had some things, but a lot of it was the loss of like the binary formatter, the serializer that was built into .NET from the beginning, and now in .NET 9 is going to go away, be obsoleted. But we relied on that, for example, but Silverlight didn't have it. And in reflection, I guess I mentioned that. So the early versions of Silverlight did not have a full implementation of reflection. And so all of our use of reflection had to be redone or rethought. And that too was great, because that was resulted not only in becoming less platform dependent, but also huge performance improvements, because especially back then, reflection was relatively slow.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you've had You've seen so many things and you have so much experience. I want to kind of get your perspective as you look at the various decades. I mean, my experience only goes back to 97 in a real way, so I don't know what came before, but I lived through the mega monolith, large systems in a single code base, build everything, deploy literally every piece together, to the conversation of, maybe we should do distributed systems. What the heck does service-oriented architecture mean? How should we have, one process talk to another process? And then the conversation about microservices is like, no, we need to have all kinds of little pieces running around and web services. And so that with so many new developers in the industry, I've said that so many times, but I mean, our industry has exploded. We have lots of developers who are in their first decade of experience, and they probably don't have any experience with the really, really large code bases. Because we had the conversations on how should we structure layers and segmentation? How should we, because we have this massive single code base, how should we, make separation within it? And now a new generation is saying, no. I have separation on the outside. I don't have separation inside it. I have my separation on the outside, and I just have tons of web services talking through. Do you have a favorite general architecture when it comes to when to segment a different process and split things out versus no, these things need to be running in the same process? How do you think about that general spectrum?
That was a nice summary, and I smile because I'm a little bit older than you in that I guess I started in 87 as a real developer, so at that time, the mainframe world was still vibrant, I worked in the mini computer space, DECVAX and Unix type stuff, and so we were the scrappy upstarts that were fighting against the mainframe elite, and I think about that, and I think we had to figure all this stuff out, and the mainframe people were kind of laughing at us because they were like, oh well, we already figured it out. But then of course you look at a lot of their code and it's crap. I mean, so to say that they already had it figured out is, but I think it's the same kind of thing where it's like every generation, if you will, of folks that come into our industry, to some degree, I think it's a fault of our education and training systems, and that we don't train on, we're not good at capturing decades and decades of lessons learned and then translating them in a way that I think like physics and chemistry, some of the other sciences are better at doing that, because you can't move chemistry or physics forward if you spend the first decade of your career relearning several hundred years of you know what I mean?
Right.
And I'm not really answering your question, am I? But I'm
going
on.
You are.
But I think it's important that we think about think forward. And I guess it's maybe not you and me, but it's the educational systems. But how do we short circuit this whole thing where people feel like because I'm not aware of like a history of computer or software architecture class in a college, right? But there should be one, because we've gone through, procedural programming, linear programming, procedural programming, component-based, object-oriented services, all of these different architectures, and there's lessons to be learned from all of them. And I think part of the problem, to come back to maybe a more direct answer to your question, the problem is people are always looking for like the one architecture that I can use to do all of the things.
Yeah.
And I think that's ridiculous, because any large scale business application in particular is going to have different problem spaces inside the overall solution some of which are going to be really, really well served by well layered, well organized client server type application for a variety of reasons. Other parts of the application are probably more volatile, which is where really service-based solutions come into play as a deployment vehicle more than anything else. And the reason you need a service is because the service implementation changes independently of the rest of the app or other apps that are using it. And if that's not the case, right? Like I've seen people create services for something that never changes.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, really that should have been a DLL, because why are you doing all of that expensive cross, network-based communication and all of the infrastructure and everything to run this service that you haven't changed, you don't expect to ever change it. It's probably going to stay the same for 20 years. It should be a DLL so that it's running in process.
Yeah.
Because, but the flip side, where maybe I've got some regulatory compliance check and the regulations change on a regular basis because of, maybe municipal, county, state, or federal, legal changes, and it's highly unpredictable. And why would I redeploy all my other apps and have to rebuild them? When I could isolate this volatile bit of functionality into a service. Now I can cost justify running a server, the infrastructure for it, and I can cost justify the overhead of calling it over networks all the time, because I'm like, hey, look at all of the pain I'm saving myself. And I guess now I'm on a rant here, but I'll come back to, really, to me, we don't ask why nearly enough. More developers need to put themselves in the mindset of a 3-year-old and say, why are we doing this thing? What's the cost benefit analysis on this particular architecture? And I was going to say right now, but it's hard to imagine in the current state of things where having a bajillion services is cost effective.
Yeah.
Right. There's just so much complexity and overhead in both tech and people levels, which is not to say you shouldn't use services, because you absolutely should if you have a problem they solve.
Yeah.
But the cheapest software model or architecture that we have today is an N layer architecture where things are well separated. Separation of concerns between presentation, business logic, data access, even if they're all running in the same process, which ideally maybe they are, because that gives you the best performance overall and so forth. But again, you got to say, why am I doing this thing versus something else?
Yeah. Yeah. I remember probably in the early 2000s, jumping onto a team, getting into a system where I wasn't involved in the code base. It was several years old, but it was .NET, so it was only 5 years old. Come to think of it, but it was already a mess. It was already a mess.
Yep.
It would be derided with what is now, people use derogatory term. Oh, it's a monolith. What they really mean is it's like this big chunk of spaghetti code. You can't pull it apart, and every time you change something else breaks. But it was just all one Visual Studio solution and didn't have any automated tests. Of course, in the beginning, the early 2000s, test-driven development was just starting to be adopted. And I've seen some people say, okay, because so many, single Visual Studio solution code bases have been a mess, therefore, it must be the fault of that chosen architecture, as opposed to, no, the architecture could work just fine. It's just they made a mess. And then they just say, I must use microservices. I heard that at a conference. It must be better.
Well, yeah, and I think way back to, don't ever use a go-to. And, this goes...
Go-to considered harmful.
back to basic. Of course, had go-tos right
Yep.
all over the place, but other languages that like C, there's languages that have go-tos. We just never use them because we're like, oh, right, the use of a go-to results in spaghetti code.
Yeah.
And generally that's true, but it doesn't have to be if you have discipline.
Yep.
But the tools don't help, right? That I think it's true. That tool does not help. And then you're right. If you start at the beginning of when Visual Basic started to become a real thing in 91, 92, 93, the pattern was that you put all your business logic in lost focus and button click events, and have no separation of concerns between the concepts of data access, business logic, and presentation. There was zero separation. And not that you couldn't, just that nobody did, and the tools didn't help, right? And I roll forward from that all the way to today, and still today, you fire up Visual Studio and you open the Blazor template because that's
right.
the new hotness, and I do love Blazor. But what's the easiest way to write code in Blazor? Well, start putting your business logic in button click events.
Right.
It hasn't changed. The tooling still leads you down this path of where do I put my code? Well, it's obvious that they must have thought we should put it in button click because that's the only thing in the tool.
Yeah.
And you have to take a step outside of the tool itself and look around and say, oh, well, what are my options, right? There's, different kinds of, there's clean architecture, there's CSLA, there's, vertical slice architecture, all sorts of different things that then you have to go explore and learn and figure out, which one resonates with you and you think is going to solve your business requirements over a 10 to 20 year period, right? It's like, okay, that's a huge responsibility. And then you have to get your entire development team to buy into that, not just the architecture, but the implementation of the architecture, right? Because an architecture is just a bunch of diagrams on paper.
Yeah.
And so this is where, and of course, living in this world all the time, I think, CSLA, back when it was an acronym, the A stood for architecture. And so my early books back in the 90s and early 2000s, half the book was on architecture. And then the other half was on the actual implementation. And that's part of, I think, the value is that you not only need to find an architecture, but then you need to find a framework that helps you consistently use that architecture. And another good example is the MVVM design pattern, which is not really an architecture, but it's a pattern for building presentation layers.
Yeah.
And then how do you consistently follow that pattern? Ideally, you'd have some tool that helps you. Well, that tool expresses itself, or did, as a whole bunch of competing MVVM frameworks, right?
Yeah.
And which I think was awesome. I'm saying this is a good thing because that's what you need to translate, a pattern or an architecture, which is pretty academic, into something practical. That, especially if you start thinking, oh, I'm going to have a development team of 10 people or 20 people or 120 people. You can't. Sadly, I think it's unrealistic to think I'm going to get all of those people trained up and thinking the same way about how to implement something. I need some sort of guidance that's there day in and day out, and that usually expresses itself as tools, frameworks. These days, we've got this really powerful capability of creating analyzers inside of .NET that in Visual Studio, for example, express themselves as the little light bulb and red squigglies, and I think
warnings.
too few people use those, right? Those are So Jason Bach wrote a whole set of analyzers for CSLA years ago. Oh man, that was one of the best things that ever happened, because when people are using CSLA and they forget a common, it used to be, I spent a lot of time on my forum, which is now a GitHub discussion group, but a ton of time pointing people to the FAQ that says, yes, you have to have this attribute, or yes, you have to, whatever.
Yeah.
Well, now the analyzers do it.
Nice.
You know what I mean? Boy, that rambled pretty far. So let's see where you want to go next.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
So, yeah, no, this is good. The two things I want to come back to, one is the vertical slice was horizontal, and then architecture diagrams. So you were mentioning clean architecture, vertical slice, onion architecture, client server there. And I got to thinking, how's a developer who doesn't have the benefit of, working under an experienced architect who can kind of show, how do they even know what the competing choices are? I think, like you mentioned, the education system at universities, but if we just distill it down to generally favoring vertical segmentation with vertical slice architecture versus generally favoring horizontal, layered architecture, are there any slam dunks that you found? Like, for talking to the database, separating vertical or horizontally versus in the UI, separating vertically versus horizontally. Are there any rules of thumb that you kind of generally go to where it's not literally just, oh, it depends, flip a coin, but generally you tend to favor it more, or you find more situations where you end up choosing, one versus the other?
I'm going to answer it this way, in that I think we've got this discussion thing going on in the CSLA forum about, vertical slice versus clean architecture and mediator CSLA, and it's a great discussion. People should feel free to jump in and enjoy. But I think ultimately, when I look at this, I think the job of an architect is to figure out what is the broad architecture or architectures that are going to be used when building an app. And of course, I'm thinking of an application architect here. And when I think about that, I want consistency, because consistency provides maintainability. Again, we're building, at least I'm building line of business apps. And so I'm thinking we're going to maintain this thing, or somebody's going to maintain it for the next 10 to 15 years, right? And the last thing I want is for every time they go into a different part of the app that they're going to have to learn an entirely different architecture, coding patterns, standards. That's crazy. How could you possibly cost justify that? So if you interpret vertical slice as every vertical slice gets to do their own thing, that's ridiculous. That's absurd. I like the idea of basing software around user scenarios or use cases. And in that regard, you can think of a user scenario as a vertical slice, right? It's like, hey, one or more users need to do this task. We need to build software to support that set of users on that task, right? Vertical slice, clearly. And within the business domain, they should be able to figure out how they're going to do that, right? But technologically, they should follow the architecture and patterns that have been set out app-wide. And hopefully that makes sense. And so in that regard, I think a combination of vertical for business needs, but horizontal for tech needs is the way to approach this. And when you think about, at least when I think about, when I visualize the layers that I do it like a layer cake. I guess I always have.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's that different from like the onion approach or whatever, or a hexagon. I think of
hexagonal architecture.
Yeah. I think it's just visual ways of expressing similar concepts, which are that at the heart of it is separation of concerns.
Mm-hmm.
And really, you touched on this, and I think maybe I did earlier. The thing that has been a problem, a thorn in our side ever since Visual Basic and Power Builder and all, SQL Windows, all these things became popular in the 90s. All of them led us down this road of putting business logic in the UI.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's just, and we still have that problem today, like I said. And that one thing all by itself, if you can separate your business logic and keep it out of the presentation layer, the presentation layer is volatile.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Every 5 to 10 years, we completely seem to rip off and replace the way that we think about UIs. Right?
Yeah.
We were green screen terminals, and then we were
Yep.
GUIs, and then we were browsers, and then we were mobile, and I mean, we don't know what's next, right? I mean, it could be AI text-based, or I don't know.
The vision,
but the point being, yeah, that's right. Do a little force choke on the software. But the point being that if you think about your software being, living 10 to 20 years, and you think that you want it to be relevant to the current user base 15 years from now, you probably will have had to have ripped and replaced the UI.
Yeah.
Because the technology will probably have changed out from under you. Did your business logic, did your processes, did your business as an insurance company or whatever you are change in 15 years? No, not in any meaningful way,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so if you can keep the business logic out of the UI, you can rip off the UI, build a new one with minimal changes to the business layer, because your business processes, the fact that you have customers, you make products and you sell them, hasn't changed, and probably won't for the next ever. You know what I mean?
Right.
And then the other big separation of concerns area is data access. There too, I look back and I think, man, in some ways, the record set, data set, result set world that existed for 15 years was kind of nice, because it was productive, it was simple, it was seductive. Did I say that?
That's right. It was so easy, so easy to use.
It's like the dark side of the force, though, right? It's
right.
Like you go down that road, and forever will it dominate your path in a really bad way.
Yeah. As long as you don't have to, scale the application, as long as performance bumps along the bottom, and you got if you can know the names of all the people using your software, you're generally okay with it.
Yeah. There, and see, that's nice. Well put. So again, we're in this spot where, ideally no data access artifacts leak into your business or presentation layers.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I use the word leak a lot. I'm like, did your business logic leak into your UI?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I frame it that way is because it's so easy. I mean, it's just, you know what I mean? It's like, this number or this value needs to be a number, so I'll just put a little validation thing in the UI. And that might be okay if it gives the user a better experience. But the problem is that if you didn't also put it in the business layer, someday when you tear off that UI, that rule will get lost.
Right.
And or you put so many rules in the UI that you can never tear the UI off, which is where all the people that are maintaining, web forms, Windows forms, WPF apps are trapped.
Yeah. And you mentioned the application architect is kind of providing the ways, the standards, and the norms. And with all of the tools that we have in the language and the base class library, there's always a way to define the business logic away from the user interface, but yet at runtime, have it run in the user interface. We have
Yes.
plenty of ways to do that. So our hands aren't tied. We don't have to pick either or. But as you're talking, I was thinking, the user interface is the one that we encounter the most. And we think, oh yeah, all the code is in the UI. And of course, if I'm in a file that has some HTML in it, then I'm in a code file that is making things that I'm going to see. That's what HTML does. It formats, kind of lays out the screen. So I'm in interface code. But you mentioned data access, which that's interfacing with a database server, which is running outside of my applications process. If I'm going to send or read something from a queue, I'm interfacing with something else. If I'm going to call a web service at some other third-party system, that's an interface with something else. And so how I keep it straight in my head, I want to know how is the UI and the data layer, those are kind of like big ones. But generally, would you agree that this same really rule of thumb applies for every type of interface, no matter the reason that we would, leave the boundary of our currently running deployed process and reach out to somewhere else? That generally we want to keep all of our business logic away from all types of interfaces? Or are there some exceptions in your mind?
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. The way I think about it again, or visualize it, is like a layer cake. And the reason I do that is because at least in my mind, at the top of the cake is the interface that you are exposing to the world. And so
it's the icing.
If I write code that nobody can interact with, obviously my code is useless, right? So I have some sort of consumer that I'm interacting with. And so at the top is this interface for my consumer. And the consumer might be a person. And so that interface might be HTML or XAML or whatever. But my consumer might be another app, in which case my interface might be JSON or binary streams or whatever. Or my interface might be a physical device, in which case my interface might be some like blinking lights or, I don't know.
Right.
But the point is, at the very top of my cake, there's an interface for my consumer.
What a quick mic cutout. You're talking about the layer cake, and you always have some type of interface. And so with all the interfaces having the same type of problem, I think of all the web service developers out there, and you're talking about JSON and whatnot. And so if I put all of my logic right there in the web API controller, am I not just putting all of my business logic again in some type of, it's not the user interface, but it's an application, programming interface?
Yes, it is. Yeah. And that's exactly, I think, where we get into trouble. And because that too, right? We were on, XML, and now we're on JSON, and in the future, now gRPC is becoming popular.
Yeah.
So, are you going to do protobuf? And so, I think it's critical that when we think about separation from the interface that I expose to my consumer, my business logic should never be, and this is where in my layer cake, there are 5 layers. The first one's the interface. That's like the JSON or the HTML. The second is interface control, which is usually a presenter, view model, controller, whatever. And those combined are the presentation layer, the way we used to think about it, right? Zero business logic should go in either one of those. And they should talk to a business layer. And here too, I think we get into a challenge at this layer, because there's the M family of design patterns, right? MVC, MVP, MVVM.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of them. And people look at those and think, oh, that's my application architecture. But it's not.
No.
Those design patterns are only for the presentation layer.
Right.
And if you really look at the patterns, they tell you not to put business logic in the controller, the view, or the model.
Yeah.
And then you say, well, where do I put my business logic? And they're like, somewhere else.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. Thanks. but that's where you've got to come up with something that helps you figure out how you're going to implement and keep your business logic maintainable, which is again, in my world, kind of that's the purpose of CSLA right there. That's it. But if we continue this through the layer cake, right, to your point, then you get the data access layer, and then the bottom layer is data storage.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think, and I agree with you 100% that those are interfaces. So if basically the data access layer exists to talk to whatever it is that's storing the data.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an interface. Now I've become the consumer. So my top level interface is what I expose to my consumers.
Mm-hmm.
The bottom level interface, that data access layer, is, hey, my data might be stored behind a bunch of web services or behind a bunch of stored procedures, which really are kind of the same thing, or maybe it's in an Excel file, or it's on a mainframe that I'm still calling, or maybe it's a combination of several things, right? That's especially if you're in a large, complicated legacy, enterprise. It might be that it's like, most of my data is in this, SQL Server, but we've got some over here in this old mainframe, and so when I have to call both,
Mm-hmm.
right? Well, that's what the data access layer is for, is to mitigate all of that, so that your business logic doesn't care,
Mm-hmm.
And your presentation layers don't care. It's all isolated. Again, it's the separation of concerns that, and you put them into layers, and so again, in regards to, an onion, hexagon, clear, clean, all of those ways of visualizing this problem, or use my layer cake approach. Really, they're trying to get at a way of presenting the same general solution, which is separation of concerns. And I come back to, that's all great because we put it all on paper, but in the trenches, day to day, when I'm trying to meet a deadline as a developer, right, that piece of paper means nothing.
Mm-hmm.
It's what are the tools and what are the patterns, what frameworks, basically what's making my life easiest, and I'm probably going to follow that path. Developers are like water; they follow the path of least resistance, right? Or electricity.
Well, that point is, like you mentioned, you had a tendency. That point, I've always favored using the Visual Studio project system to isolate dependencies, because if a developer is in a project in a class file, and IntelliSense is popping them up all their choices, they start typing something and IntelliSense is popping up all the choices. Well, okay, great. Oh, I want to call that one. Well, if I have to remember which ones that I have a reference to and I can easily get to by adding a using statement, but oh wait, in this code file, I need to remember not to use it. Well, that's hard. That's not the path of least resistance. But if we structure the project references, so if I'm in a code file in a particular project, it shouldn't, in my opinion, it shouldn't be tempting to use code from the wrong library. Or
yes,
and that's since I created Onion architecture, it's heavy on dependency management. One of my annoyances is being in some business logic code and IntelliSense just suggesting to me that I directly call my data context or entity framework or some data access code. I'm like, no, I don't want that. I got all these types available. I can use all of them, but I'm not in my data layer. No. And so I've always been in favor of flipping that reference, using a C# interface and flipping that reference so that when I'm in my business logic code, I don't even know about all the data access types. I have, and because path of least resistance.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you 100%. And you're right. Although I really like the newer Visual Studio feature where it'll come up with and suggest, hey, I can add this package reference for you. That's awfully convenient. But you're right. It can cause an accidental where your business layer directly uses entity framework or something, which is like,
Yeah.
No, that would be bad.
Now, you and I, and every senior developer out there is like, that's really not a problem. I know not to do that. Why are you worried about that problem? And they're right. You and I are not the problem with that. We could probably, have the wherewithal, even if it was, no, I'm not going to use it here. But the least experienced developer on the team, they're just going to do it. They're not going to know.
Right. I totally agree with you. And that's exactly right. And not to dismiss that particular feature of Visual Studio because it's pretty cool, but then it becomes a training issue, right? It's like, Miss Junior Developer, please don't ever use that feature, right? But that's not new. I think back to one of my very first, quote unquote, real jobs, and I worked for a guy named Mark, and Mark had written up this document listing the features of the language and platform that were available, and then also listing all the language features that were off limits.
Nice.
And me coming directly out of university into this thing, I'm like, oh, but that's a really cool feature, and you've ruled it out. And I was I'm sure I was a thorn in his side because I'm like, hey, this is a great feature. And he's like, yeah, but if we start using that feature, then everybody has to learn that feature, right? And it's a nuanced feature that would be easy to get wrong, and we're better off if we just stick to these other simpler features. And I'm like, but I think that's, I look back on, I learned so many lessons from that because he was right. Even though I railed against the boundaries that he'd set, he was totally right, because we had this highly maintainable code base that was highly consistent. Every you could look at a piece of code and not be able to tell which developer wrote it.
Nice.
And that was awesome. And then we got acquired by a company where they had zero standards. And this is what really drove it home to me, because I kid you not, we at this point we're using a language called VAX Basic, which was quite modern. It was more like Pascal, but it turns out that you could make it look like Fortran, you could make it look like COBOL, you could make it look like AppleSoft Basic with line numbers. And this acquiring company had all of the above. And and our pattern, I guess we had chosen, or Mark had chosen, that everything pretty much worked the way Pascal worked, or C, and it was very nice and very clean. And oh man, it was just this getting merged in with this complete chaos. And these developers were not stupid. This is the thing. They chose their patterns because nobody else could maintain their code. You see what I'm saying? It's like, this one guy wrote everything like it was Fortran. Well, nobody else wanted to maintain his code because it was, so different from what they were doing. And whereas the world, that I had been hired into, every developer could work on anybody else's code because it was always consistent.
You were doing collective code ownership before it was cool,
I guess. Yeah, right. This was back in 87, 88, something like that, a long time ago.
Well, you had that explosion in the 90s, and then the Agile Manifesto in 2001, which was to look back and say, oh, okay, we as an industry are doing a whole bunch of things that don't make sense. We need to shift here. Well, hey, we're kind of on our time here, but man, this is a fascinating discussion. I appreciate you coming back on the show and talking to us about your philosophy on architecture and how it plays out. I know that listeners got a lot of value from this conversation.
Yeah, I hope so. I obviously really enjoy this sort of topic, and I think it's something that I'm not going to solve in my time in the industry, but boy, it would be really nice to start seeing movement toward capturing a lot of what we're talking about here. And see, there's all these people that have all of this wealth of experience, and we have to figure out a more efficient way to pass that on to future upcoming developers so that they can short circuit having to kind of relearn everything, right?
Yeah, for sure. If you don't know history, you're condemned to repeat it.
Yeah, there you go.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on the show. And dear listener, until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.